The lights blazed hot in the CNN studio as Mark Levin adjusted his glasses, his weathered face set in a familiar scowl. Across from him sat Representative Jasmine Crockett, the 43-year-old Democrat from Texas, her burgundy blazer crisp and professional. The tension in the room was thick enough to cut with a knife. What started as a routine political debate was about to explode into something nobody saw coming. Just moments earlier, during the commercial break, Levin had made a comment that sent shockwaves through the green room. Another lawyer-turned-politician who thinks a law degree makes her qualified to run the country, he had muttered, loud enough for the cameras to catch. Crockett's eyes had flashed, but she said nothing. She was saving her ammunition, the ready. Recording light flickered on, and CNN anchor Anderson Cooper tried to maintain control. But everyone in that studio knew they were sitting on a powder keg. Levin, the conservative radio host with over 40 years of legal and media experience, had just challenged someone he clearly thought was beneath his notice. What he didn't know was that Jasmine Crockett had been waiting her entire career for this exact moment. Before we dive into what happened next, make sure you hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell so you don't miss any of the explosive political showdowns we cover. Trust me, you're going to want to see how this plays out. Because what Crockett said next didn't just end the debate. It ended Mark Levin's night entirely. The studio audience fell silent as Cooper introduced the segment. Tonight we're discussing the ongoing debates around legal qualifications in Congress with Mark Levin, constitutional lawyer and radio host, and Representative Jasmine Crockett of Texas, who serves on the House Judiciary Committee. The camera panned between them, capturing the stark contrast. Levin sat forward, fingers steepled, ready for what he assumed would be an easy victory. Crockett sat back, calm and composed, a slight smile playing at the corners of her mouth. Mark, you've been quite vocal about what you see as a lack of serious legal minds in Congress, Cooper began. Care to elaborate? Levin's voice cut through the studio like a rusty blade. Anderson, we have people in Congress today who think having a law degree qualifies them to interpret the Constitution. But there's a difference between passing the bar and actually practicing law at the highest levels. Some of these representatives, he glanced pointedly at Crockett, have impressive titles but thin resumes. The first shot had been fired. Crockett's expression didn't change, but something shifted in her posture. She was no longer just sitting there. She was coiling like a spring. The camera caught it all. Levin's smug satisfaction, Cooper's slight wince, and Crockett's dangerous calm. Are you referring to anyone specific, Mark? Cooper asked, though everyone in the room knew exactly who Levin meant. Levin leaned back, spreading his hands in mock innocence. Well, let's just say that civil rights law and personal injury cases don't exactly prepare someone for the complexities of constitutional interpretation. I've spent decades in constitutional law, worked with the Reagan administration, built a media empire based on legal analysis. When I see representatives who've never argued a case before the Supreme Court trying to lecture the rest of us about legal precedent, he let the sentence hang, the implication crystal clear. The silence that followed was deafening. Cooper shifted uncomfortably in his chair. The studio crew exchanged glances. Everyone could feel what was coming, but nobody knew exactly what form it would take. Crockett simply nodded slowly, as if processing something very interesting. Representative Crockett, Cooper said carefully, would you like to respond to Mark's observations about legal qualifications in Congress? Jasmine Crockett straightened in her chair, and for just a moment, her smile widened. Oh, I'd love to respond to that, Anderson. Her voice was honey smooth, but there was steel underneath. I really would. The stage was set, the challenge had been issued, and Jasmine Crockett was about to show Mark Levin and the entire nation exactly what kind of lawyer he was dealing with. To understand the magnitude of what was about to unfold, you need to know who these two people really are and why this confrontation mattered so much more than just another cable news spat. Mark Levin had built his reputation as the Great One over 4 decades in conservative media and law. Born in Philadelphia, raised on conservative principles, he'd worked his way up from local radio to become one of the most influential voices in American conservatism. His resume was genuinely impressive. Chief of Staff to Attorney General Edwin Meese during the Reagan administration, president of the landmark Legal Foundation, best-selling author of books like Liberty and Tyranny, and host of one of the most listened-to radio shows in America. At 67, Levin had seen it all. He'd battled liberals in court, demolished them on radio, and watched as his brand of constitutional conservatism helped shape a generation of right-wing thinking. His show, Life, Liberty, and Levin, on Fox News, had made him a household name among Republicans. He was used to being the smartest guy in the room, the one with the deepest knowledge of constitutional law and the sharpest tongue for cutting down opponents. But Mark Levin had a weakness, and it was about to be exposed in the most public way possible. Despite all his credentials, despite his decades of influence, he had a blind spot when it came to underestimating people who didn't look like him or come from his background. He'd spent so long being right, so long being the authority, that he'd forgotten the first rule of combat: know your enemy. Jasmine Crockett represented everything that made Levin uncomfortable about the changing face of American politics. She was young, black, female, and progressive. Everything his audience loved to hate. Born and raised in St. Louis, she'd worked her way through college and law school with determination that would have impressed even her harshest critics, if they'd bothered to look. But here's what Levin hadn't bothered to research before walking into that studio. Jasmine Crockett wasn't just another politician with a law degree. She was a former civil rights attorney who had spent years in the key trenches, fighting cases that actually mattered to real people. She'd handled everything from police brutality cases to voting rights litigation. She'd argued before state supreme courts, won settlements that changed lives, and built a practice that specialized in taking on powerful institutions and winning. More importantly, she'd done something that Mark Levin, for all his constitutional expertise and media fame, had never done. She'd practiced criminal defense law. She'd stood in courtrooms defending people whose freedom hung in the balance. She'd cross-examined hostile witnesses, dismantled prosecutors' cases, and learned how to think on her feet under the kind of pressure that would break most people. While Levin had been writing books and hosting radio shows, Crockett had been in courtrooms, learning how to destroy an opponent's argument in real time, in front of judges who didn't care about her feelings or her reputation. She'd mastered the art of the verbal takedown, not for entertainment or ratings, but because people's lives depended on it. The stakes of this confrontation went far beyond personal pride. This wasn't just about 2 lawyers arguing on cable news. This was about the future of political discourse in America. Could the old guard of conservative media continue to dismiss and diminish new voices simply by questioning their credentials? Or was the landscape changing in ways that people like Mark Levin hadn't recognized? For Levin, this was supposed to be easy. Another chance to demonstrate his superior knowledge and experience. Another opportunity to put a young upstart in her place while entertaining his base. His entire brand was built on being the authority, the teacher, the one who schooled liberals on constitutional law. A loss here, especially to someone he'd so publicly dismissed, would be more than embarrassing. It would undermine the very foundation of his credibility. For Crockett, this was about something bigger than personal vindication. She represented a new generation of political leaders who were tired of being dismissed, tired of having their qualifications questioned, tired of being treated as if they didn't belong in the same room as the established powers. She'd worked too hard and accomplished too much to let some radio host with a superiority complex diminish her in front of millions of viewers. The irony was delicious and completely lost on Levin. He'd spent decades claiming that conservatives were being silenced, that the liberal media was biased against traditional voices. Yet here he was, using his platform to dismiss and silence a voice that threatened his monopoly on legal authority. He was about to learn that dismissing someone As unqualified can backfire spectacularly when that person is actually more qualified than you assumed. As the cameras rolled and the nation watched, two different visions of America were about to clash. Levin represented the old way of doing things, credentials from the right institutions, connections to the right people, and the assumption that experience in government and media automatically translated to superiority in all things. Crockett represented the new reality, competence earned through hard work, knowledge gained through real-world experience, and the refusal to be intimidated by titles or reputations. The stage was set for more than just a debate. This was going to be a master class in why you should never underestimate your opponent, especially when the cameras are rolling and the entire nation is watching. The moment Anderson Cooper opened the floor to Jasmine Crockett, the entire dynamic in the CNN studio shifted, but instead of immediately striking back, Crockett did something that caught everyone off guard. She started asking questions. "Mark, I appreciate you sharing your impressive background with our viewers," she began, her voice calm and measured. 40 years in law and media, best-selling author, former Reagan administration official. That's quite a resume. She paused, and Levin nodded slightly, clearly expecting praise to continue. "I'm curious, though. In all those years of constitutional law expertise, how many criminal defendants have you personally represented?" The question hung in the air like smoke. Levin's expression shifted slightly, but he recovered quickly. "Representative Crockett, constitutional law is about principles that govern our entire system of justice. It's not about individual cases. It's about the framework that makes all cases possible." "That's interesting," Crockett replied, still maintaining her pleasant tone. "So that would be 0 criminal defendants, then?" "I don't think the number of criminal cases is relevant to understanding constitutional." "Oh, but it is relevant, Mark." Crockett's voice remained steady, but there was a new edge to it. "Because when you dismiss civil rights law and personal injury cases as somehow beneath constitutional interpretation, you're dismissing the very cases where constitutional principles actually get tested in the real world." The studio audience was beginning to sense the shift. Cooper leaned forward slightly, recognizing that this wasn't going the way Levin had planned. The conservative radio host was starting to look less like a professor lecturing a student and more like someone who was about to be taken to school. Levin tried to regain control. "Look, Jasmine, if I may call you that, there's a difference between practice and theory. I've written extensively about the Fourth Amendment, the Fifth Amendment, due process, and I've used those amendments to keep innocent people out of prison," Crockett interrupted, her voice cutting through his explanation like a scalpel through tissue. "I've stood in courtrooms and watched prosecutors try to violate those amendments, and I've stopped them. Not in theory, Mark. In practice." The temperature in the room was rising. Levin's face was beginning to redden, and his usual commanding presence was starting to crack. Writing about the law and practicing it are both important. Are they equally important, though? Crockett's question was surgical in its precision. "Because you started this conversation by suggesting that my legal background, civil rights and personal injury law, somehow makes me less qualified to understand constitutional principles. But here's what I'm not understanding. How does writing books about the Constitution make you more qualified than someone who's actually used the Constitution to protect people's rights in court?" The trap was beginning to close, and Levin could feel it. He'd walked into the studio expecting to debate theory with someone he assumed knew less than he did. Instead, he was being systematically dismantled by someone who understood not just the theory, but its practical application in ways he never had. "My experience in the Reagan administration," Levin began, "was administrative work," Crockett finished, "which is valuable, absolutely. But let's be clear about what that was. You advised on policy. You worked with other lawyers and officials to interpret existing law for administrative purposes. That's important work, but it's not courtroom work. It's not criminal defense work. It's not civil rights litigation work," Cooper tried to interject, sensing the debate was getting away from Levin entirely. Perhaps we could— No, Anderson, I think this is important, Crockett continued, and for the first time, her smile had a predatory quality. Because Mark opened this conversation by questioning my qualifications. He suggested that my background in civil rights law doesn't prepare me for constitutional interpretation. But I'm starting to wonder what exactly qualifies him to make that judgment. Levin was visibly frustrated now, his usual smooth delivery replaced by choppy, defensive responses. I've been studying constitutional law for 4 decades. Studying it? Yes. But have you ever had to use the Fourth Amendment to challenge an illegal search that could send your client to prison for 20 years? Have you ever argued that prosecutorial misconduct violated your client's Fifth Amendment rights? Have you ever fought to ensure that someone got their Sixth Amendment right to effective counsel? Each question was like a hammer blow, and Levin was stumbling under the assault. Constitutional law is broader than individual criminal cases. Of course it is, Crockett agreed. But you can't claim to understand the Constitution without understanding how it actually works when people's lives are on the line. And that's exactly what civil rights lawyers do every single day. We take those beautiful principles you write about in your books, and we make them mean something in the real world. The studio was dead silent except for the hum of cameras and lights. Cooper looked like he was watching a car accident in slow motion. Levin's team in the green room was probably reaching for their phones, trying to figure out how to end this disaster. But Crockett wasn't finished. She'd been building to something, and now she was ready to deliver the knockout blow. Mark, you mentioned that you've never argued a case before the Supreme Court, as if that's some kind of gold standard for legal expertise. But let me ask you this. Have you ever won a case that saved someone's life? Have you ever convinced a jury that your client was innocent when everyone else assumed they were guilty? Have you ever stood up in a courtroom and fought for someone who had no voice, no power, no money, nothing but you standing between them and injustice? Levin opened his mouth to respond, but no words came. For perhaps the first time in his professional life, the great communicator had nothing to say, because that's what civil rights lawyers do, Crockett continued, her voice rising with passion now. That's what personal injury lawyers do when they're fighting for people who've been hurt by powerful corporations. That's what criminal defense lawyers do when they're protecting the presumption of innocence. We don't just study the Constitution, Mark. We live it. We breathe it. We fight for it every single day in courtrooms across this country. The escalation was complete. What had started as Mark Levin's attempt to embarrass a junior congresswoman had become a systematic destruction of his credibility. The hunter had become the hunted, and everyone in that studio knew it. But the worst was yet to come. Anderson Cooper made one last attempt to give Mark Levin a way out. But it was too late. The damage was done, and Jasmine Crockett was just getting started. Mark, would you like to respond to Representative Crockett's points about practical legal experience? Cooper asked, though his tone suggested he already knew this was a lost cause. Levin straightened in his chair, trying to summon the authority that had served him so well for decades. Look, I think we're getting lost in the weeds here. The point I was making is that constitutional scholarship— The point you were making, Crockett interrupted, is that my legal background somehow makes me less qualified than you to understand constitutional law. But what I'm hearing now is that you've never actually practiced law in the way that most lawyers understand it. You've been an academic, an administrator, and a media personality, all valuable roles, but not exactly what most people think of when they hear constitutional lawyer. The studio audience was transfixed. This wasn't just a political debate anymore. This was a masterclass in courtroom advocacy being delivered. Live on national television. Levin made another attempt to regain control. My work with the Landmark Legal Foundation is also administrative and advocacy work, Crockett cut him off again. Important work, but again, not trial work, not criminal defense work, not the kind of work where you have to know the Constitution so well you can cite it from memory while you're fighting for someone's freedom. And then came the moment that would be replayed on social media for weeks to come. Crockett leaned forward slightly, and her voice took on the tone of a prosecutor, delivering the closing argument in a murder trial. Mark, let me tell you what constitutional law looks like in the real world. Last year I had a client, before I came to Congress, who was facing 30 years in prison because police violated his Fourth Amendment rights during a search. The prosecutor had physical evidence. They had what looked like a confession. They had what seemed like an open and shut case. But they got that evidence illegally. She paused, letting the weight of the story settle over the studio. Now, I could have read your books about the Fourth Amendment. I could have quoted your radio show commentary about unreasonable search and seizure, but that wasn't going to keep my client out of prison. What kept him out of prison was standing up in that courtroom and convincing a judge that the Constitution actually means something. Not the theoretical Constitution you write about, but the living, breathing Constitution that protects real people from real government overreach. Levin tried to interrupt, but Crockett was in full flow now, and nothing was going to stop her. The judge suppressed the evidence. The case was dismissed. A young father got to go home to his family instead of spending the next 3 decades in prison. That's constitutional law, Mark. That's what it looks like when it actually matters. The silence in the studio was deafening. Cooper looked like he was watching a master craftsman at work. Levin's face had gone from red to pale, and his hands were gripping the arms of his chair. But Crockett still wasn't finished. She had one more arrow in her quiver, and this one was going to end the fight once and for all. You want to know the difference between us, Mark? The difference is that I've never had to question anyone else's qualifications to make myself feel important. My work speaks for itself. My wins speak for themselves. My client's freedom speaks for itself. She leaned back in her chair, completely relaxed now, while Levin looked like he was fighting to stay upright. But since you brought up qualifications, let me ask you one more question. In all your years of constitutional expertise, in all your books and radio shows and media appearances, have you ever had a case where you were wrong and someone went to prison because of it? Because I have. And let me tell you, that's a weight you carry with you for the rest of your life. That's what makes you study harder, fight harder, and never, ever assume you're the smartest person in the room. The knockout punch had been delivered, but Crockett had one final twist that nobody saw coming. Actually, Mark, there's something I should probably mention. Her smile returned, but now it was the smile of someone who'd been holding back their best card for the perfect moment. You keep talking about Supreme Court experience like it's the ultimate measure of a constitutional lawyer. Well, I argued, a case before the Texas Supreme Court last year that established new precedent for Fourth Amendment protections in digital searches. The case has been cited in 3 federal circuit courts and is being watched by the U.S. Supreme Court as a potential case for review. The studio audience gasped audibly. Cooper's eyes widened. Even the camera operators seemed to shift position to get a better shot of the carnage. So when you say I haven't argued before the Supreme Court, you're technically right. But I've done something better. I've created law that the Supreme Court is considering. I've established precedent that's protecting people's constitutional rights right now, today, in courtrooms across the country. Mark Levin, the great communicator, the constitutional expert, the man who'd built a career on having the last word, sat in stunned silence. For the first time in decades, he had absolutely nothing to say. But hey, Crockett added, her tone light and almost conversational now, I'm sure your books are very educational too. The debate was over, the war was won, and Jasmine Crockett had just delivered one of the most complete intellectual destructions in the history of cable news television. The moment CNN cut to commercial break, the internet exploded. Within minutes, Crockett Destroys Levin was trending on Twitter, TikTok videos were already being edited, and political commentary shows were scrambling to book anyone who could provide insight into what viewers had just witnessed. The immediate aftermath in the CNN studio was almost as dramatic as the debate itself. Mark Levin, who had spent 4 decades as one of conservative media's most commanding figures, sat in his chair looking like a man who'd just watched his reputation crumble in real time. He mumbled something about needing to leave for another commitment and was escorted out by his handlers before the show even ended. Anderson Cooper, veteran of thousands of political interviews, later told colleagues it was the most one-sided, intellectual beatdown he'd ever witnessed on live television. "I've seen politicians destroy each other before," he said, "but I've never seen anyone systematically dismantle another person's entire professional identity in 20 minutes. But the real story was happening online, where clips of Crockett's performance were being shared at viral speeds. The moment where she asked Levin about his criminal defense experience was immediately turned into memes. The revelation about her Texas Supreme Court case became the subject of fact-checkers working overtime to verify what seemed too good to be true. It was all accurate. And her final line, "I'm sure your books are very educational too," became an instant catchphrase for political comebacks. Conservative media found itself in an impossible position. Levin was one of their own, a beloved figure whose credibility had been built over decades. But the destruction had been so complete, so public, and so well documented that there was no way to spin it as anything other than a total defeat. Fox News initially tried to downplay the incident, but when their own audience started sharing clips of Crockett's performance with comments like, "She destroyed him," and "This is what a real lawyer looks like," they had to acknowledge what had happened. Rush Limbaugh's successor on his radio show spent an entire segment trying to defend Levin, but ended up inadvertently making Crockett's points for her. "Mark Levin has been fighting for constitutional principles for 40 years, he argued, which only reinforced Crockett's assertion that Levin had been talking about the Constitution rather than using it to protect real people. Meanwhile, progressive media was having a field day. MSNBC played extended clips of the debate with legal experts breaking down exactly how Crockett had systematically demolished every argument Levin made. Rachel Maddow devoted an entire segment to researching Crockett's legal career and found even more impressive wins that hadn't come up during the debate. The Washington Post ran a piece titled, "The Night Conservative Media's Constitutional Expert Met an Actual Constitutional Lawyer." The article detailed Crockett's legal career, including the Texas Supreme Court case she'd mentioned, and contrasted it with Levin's primarily administrative and media-based experience. Legal professionals across the political spectrum were weighing in as well. Even some conservative lawyers were quietly admitting that Crockett had made valid points about the difference between theoretical knowledge and practical application of constitutional law. But the most significant impact was on the careers of both participants. For Mark Levin, the debate represented the beginning of the end of his status as conservative media's go-to constitutional expert. Ratings for his radio show dipped in the weeks following the CNN appearance. His publishers quietly delayed the high-tide release of his next book. And most damaging of all, other conservative media figures began to distance themselves from him, unwilling to risk their own credibility by association. The clips of his silence during Crockett's final assault became a symbol of the intellectual bankruptcy that critics had always accused conservative media of harboring. When your entire brand is built on being the authority, being publicly shown to be unprepared and outmatched is a career-ending event. For Jasmine Crockett, the opposite happened. Overnight, she became the face of a new generation of political leaders who weren't intimidated by the old guard's credentials and weren't willing to be dismissed without a fight. Her congressional office was flooded with interview requests, speaking invitations, and job offers from major law firms. More importantly, her performance had demonstrated something that political observers had been debating for years. The old model of credibility, based on connections, institutional affiliations, and media presence, was being challenged by a new model based on actual competence and real-world results. Democratic Party leadership took notice as well. Nancy Pelosi called Crockett personally to congratulate her. Chuck Schumer mentioned the debate during a Senate floor speech about the importance of having real legal expertise in Congress. And several political action committees began discussing Crockett as a potential candidate for higher office. The debate also sparked a broader conversation about expertise in American politics. How many other so-called experts, commentators asked, were actually just people who talked about subjects rather than people who practiced them? The Crockett standard became shorthand for the idea that practical experience should carry more weight than theoretical knowledge when evaluating someone's qualifications. Within days of the debate, investigative journalists began digging deeper into the backgrounds of other prominent media experts across the political spectrum. What they found was revealing. Many of the most vocal commentators on legal issues had never practiced law in the traditional sense. Economics experts who had never run businesses, military analysts who had never served in combat, foreign policy authorities who had never worked overseas. The revelation sparked what media critics dubbed the Great Credential Check of 2024. Cable news shows found themselves having to defend their choice of guests more carefully. Bookers who had previously relied on name recognition and media savvy were suddenly asking harder questions about actual experience and expertise. CNN's competitor networks tried to capitalize on the moment by highlighting their own experts' practical backgrounds. MSNBC began including detailed credential summaries when introducing legal analysts. Fox News quietly stopped booking several regular contributors whose backgrounds couldn't withstand scrutiny, but the impact went far beyond media appearances. Social media users began applying the Crockett test to politicians, commentators, and public figures across all fields. The simple question, "What have you actually done?" became a viral way of challenging authority figures who relied more on credentials than results. Law schools began using the debate as a teaching tool, showing students the difference between academic knowledge and courtroom skills. The moment where Crockett asked Levin about his criminal defense experience became a classic example of how to cross-examine a witness who's trying to overstate their qualifications. Professor Janet Martinez at Harvard Law School incorporated the entire debate into her trial advocacy course. This is what happens when someone with real courtroom experience encounters someone who's been coasting on reputation, she told her students. Crockett didn't just win an argument, she demonstrated why actual practice matters more than theoretical knowledge. The clip became required viewing in legal advocacy programs across the country. Mock trial competitions began using scenarios based on the debate. Law students started calling unprepared arguments pulling a Levin. Meanwhile, the political ramifications continued to ripple outward. Republican strategists privately acknowledged that the debate had exposed a fundamental weakness in conservative media's approach to credibility. For years, they had relied on impressive-sounding titles and institutional affiliations to establish authority. Crockett had shown how vulnerable that strategy was when confronted by someone with actual expertise. Democratic operatives, emboldened by Crockett's success, began recruiting more candidates with hands-on professional experience rather than just political connections. The 2024 election cycle saw an unprecedented number of practicing doctors, teachers, engineers, and lawyers running for office, many explicitly contrasting their practical experience with their opponents' theoretical credentials. The business world took notice as well. Corporate boards began scrutinizing their members' actual experience more carefully after several high-profile disasters involving directors who had impressive resumes but little relevant hands-on knowledge. The phrase, "Has this person actually done what they claim to be an expert in?" became standard due diligence. Even academic institutions weren't immune to the scrutiny. Universities found themselves defending the practical relevance of their curricula. Business schools began emphasizing internships and real-world projects. Medical schools expanded their clinical training requirements. Law schools, already under pressure from declining bar passage rates, accelerated their move toward more practical, skills-based education. The entertainment industry, always quick to capitalize on viral moments, began developing projects based on the debate. A streaming service announced a limited series about courtroom lawyers taking on media personalities. A documentary crew began following Crockett's congressional work. And comedy shows had a field day with parodies of experts being exposed as frauds. 6 months later, Mark Levin announced he was taking a step back from regular media appearances to focus on writing. Industry insiders understood this as a face-saving way of acknowledging that his credibility had been irreparably damaged. His radio show was eventually canceled, and his book sales never recovered. The few interviews he gave during this period were painful to watch. Gone was the confident, commanding presence that had defined his career. In his place was a man who seemed to question every statement before making it, clearly aware that his every word would be scrutinized for evidence of overreach or exaggeration. Conservative media attempted a rehabilitation campaign, highlighting Levin's genuine accomplishments and downplaying the debate as a single bad night. But the damage was irreversible. Once someone's expertise has been publicly demolished, it's nearly impossible to rebuild that authority. Other conservative figures distanced themselves, unwilling to risk guilt by association. Jasmine Crockett, meanwhile, was named to the House Judiciary Committee's Subcommittee on Constitutional Law. She wrote a best-selling book about her legal career titled The Constitution in Action, A Civil Rights Lawyer's Journey, and political pundits began speculating about her potential as a future Supreme Court nominee. But perhaps more importantly, Crockett had become a symbol of something larger than herself. She represented the possibility that merit could triumph over connections, that substance could defeat style, and that the old gatekeepers of credibility and authority were no longer invulnerable. Speaking at a legal conference 6 months after the debate, Crockett reflected on what had happened that night. "I didn't set out to destroy anyone's career," she said. "I just asked some basic questions that any lawyer should be able to answer. The fact that those questions caused such a reaction says more about our standards for expertise than it does about me." The audience gave her a standing ovation, but her point was serious. The debate had exposed how often American public discourse elevated people who sounded authoritative over people who actually knew what they were talking about. It had shown how many experts were actually just people who had gotten very good at talking about subjects they had never actually practiced. The debate became a watershed moment in American political discourse, marking the end of an era when credentials and institutional authority could substitute for actual competence and expertise. It showed that the old guard's attempts to dismiss new voices based on assumptions about their backgrounds could backfire spectacularly when those voices were actually more qualified than anyone had bothered to discover. Most importantly, it demonstrated that in the age of social media and instant fact-checking, you can't fake expertise for long. The days when someone could build a career on talking about subjects they'd never actually practiced were ending, and Jasmine Crockett's destruction of Mark Levin was both the proof and the cause of that change. As one political commentator put, Mark Levin spent 40 years building his reputation as a constitutional expert. Jasmine Crockett destroyed it in 20 minutes by asking him to prove it. The revolution in political credibility had begun, and it started with a simple question. How many criminal defendants have you personally represented? Before you go, make sure to hit that like button if you enjoyed watching this political masterclass, and don't forget to subscribe for more explosive political breakdowns. Because in today's political landscape, you never know when the next supposed expert is going to meet someone who actually knows what they're talking about. And trust me, you're going to want to see what happens when they do.